Hi everyone, welcome to Minimum Viable Podcast, a podcast series brought to you by PM School. I am Ankit, one of the co-founders of PM School, and I co-host this podcast with my good friend and co-founder Nikunj Sharma. Today on the podcast, we have a very special guest. She's the co-founder of a very cool design studio, Spinach Studio. She's Eshani and interestingly, PM School and both Spinach Studio have had a very long and a very great association for the last three and a half and 4 years. And interestingly, just before the podcast, Eshani was also telling us that she's been involved in designing a number of startups which have come out of the Powai Valley. So welcome to the podcast, Eshani.
Hi Nikunj, hi Ankit. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to speak to both of you today.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Great to have you here. Great to have you here.
All right, Eshani. So the first one is a very basic, simple primer on your story, especially from how did you started Spinach? Like just going deep into, I understand that you had a career in design. And also, if I'm not wrong, you had said that you did work in the ads and media industry for quite some time. So would love to understand how did you transition from that to like starting your own company, right? There has been had been a lot of movements in startup founders' life wherein they figure out, hey, there's like a potential sort of problem space they want to work on. But what exactly prompted you to start like a design studio? And my sense is since 2014 or 15, you've been at it. You've been helping a lot of startups in the Powai Valley, as Ankit said it. What made you start Spinach Studios?
So that's a good question, actually. So I think Nikunj, we know each other since 2016, 2017. And if you had asked me then that, would you ever think of starting your own design company? I would have said, not really. I mean, that's too much work. So frankly, it was not something that was on my cards. Like, of course, being an entrepreneur is very cool sounding. It's always been, but it was not for me. Like, I didn't think that, my trajectory would take me into this direction. But, with all the work that, I was doing for the Powai startups, and plus little known fact is that I also had my own startup, that I was a co-founder at a IIT Bombay funded startup in 2017, around the same time after Purple Squirrel. I realized that a lot of good companies, right, and the tech space was evolving quite well at that point in time. They could do with the consulting nature of design. And what I mean by that is that not everybody wanted just a wireframe or a visual design. People also wanted to understand how to approach their customers, what kind of experience, is viable for them to launch or maybe to relaunch at some point. I think these nuances drove me, towards the entire consulting space much more than I would have expected myself to be. And it was very organic. After the startup, we wound up the startup around 2017, I think, was the needle when everything moved. And at that point, it became a lot of work to manage. I was not able to cope, let's so to say. There were not enough time, and then it felt like okay, it's time that. So I think the first person, when you sort of have a new person joining you, when you become one freelancer to like two people in one garage, and when you open a formal bank account which has a company name on it, and I think that's when you realize, okay, you're formally open now. So it was very, very organic, to answer your question. And when it's very organic, there are also lots of things that you do not envision coming your way. So the creativity and the passion obviously is always there, to solve the problems. But when you go for a proper setup, for a proper business, right, or just a proper offering, there is a lot more that you need to do in the back end or in the background. So that was very, very, I would say, interesting curve of life that I had to go through, and I wouldn't exchange it for anything else ever. Yeah.
Can you talk about how the landscape has changed from being only a services company to the kind of work that you see coming your way these days?
I mean, frankly, I have lived about 3 to 4 different career lives, right? So I started off in advertising, which has also been it could either follow this model, which is, you sort of work on a margin model, or it could also be in the consulting space, because advertising is also about idea driven work. And you still see that, right? Because even social media companies, etc., they still work on a similar model. So I would say the transition, there's like, it sort of only evolves, it doesn't dramatically change. Like I said, when I was in advertising, there was something similar. Companies choose the kind of path they want to take. Then when I went into consulting, it was not a conversation about operational, it was more about capability, or what kind of work will you provide versus what kind of talent will you provide. So I do feel that this is a very, very normal way of offering service. It could either be consulting or it could be a margin based model. It totally depends on what kind of service you want to provide, what you think is your capability, what you think is your passion at the end of the day. And I am a creative entrepreneur, right? So for me, it's always going to be more consulting. Even the kind of assignments that we choose, because of which we get a lot of repeat work, right? It is because we look at it from a creative angle. But of course, I mean, clients, because it also, the design comes from the IT sort of mindset, right? Like, it's a subset of IT, so to say, because of which the conversation might start from a consulting angle, and it could end in a consulting space, but it could also end in a, how many people, etc. So it totally depends on how the person leading the conversation takes the, whole, how they approach it, how they take it forward. Yeah.
Ishani, I want to ask you a very interesting question. It's about the product manager and design relationship, right? And since you've been a design leader throughout your career, and Nikunj and I have worked as product managers across startup, right? So sometimes you've seen an undertone of discomfort between PM and designers, right? Designers might perceive PMs as bottlenecks for their big bold ideas, and PMs might perceive designers as a resource. Unfortunately, this happens, quite a lot, and especially with younger PMs, right? So from your experience, talk to us about the best practices for PMs to work with designers.
Yeah, so this is a very interesting question, and I've worked with many, many, many product managers, and I can tell you that there are two sides to this, right? Or there are two ways to look at this. One is that it depends on the culture of the company, right? So if the culture of the company is built in a certain way, where it is very output driven, or where we say that only the product owner is accountable or responsible. When you look at the traditional RACI chart, right? It's only if there's a lot of weight on the product manager, then the poor product manager is, they are driven to behave in a certain way, right? Because they have to get the outcomes and the deliveries in place. So I think it largely depends on the culture of the company. I think the landscape has evolved a lot. I do think that product managers, they have become, I feel like they've become very open minded, because they do realize that they're not one person, they're actually a village. Like, they cannot get their work done without the village, right? So of late, like, at least in the past few years, I have rarely seen a conflict of interest between the product manager and the designer, because they're all working towards the same goal, right? So I think a lot of maturity has seeped into the model. Earlier, I could say yes, there was a lot of pressure on delivery timelines, etc. So product owners could feel very burdened and therefore siloed in their approach towards product building. And coming to what you asked me, right? Like, so basically, I think design, or designers should be leveraged for what value they can bring into the process. What that means is that if you are in the phase of, say, reinventing a feature, or envisioning a new sort of proposition for the product, I think designers can play a deep role. They might not be able to tell you exactly what kind of metrics that product feature will drive, but they might be able to tell you what kind of value or sort of stickiness it might build in the customer experience. So it's a different facet of product. And I think product managers could leverage that deep knowledge that designers come with when it comes to ethnography, user research, or even basic user testing, right? Like, how do you develop that mindset? And product managers can look at designers as their buddies, I think secretly all designers are in awe of product managers, because it's a hard job. Firstly, I think they're sort of grateful. I'm not that guy stuck between tech and design, fortunately. It is a very hard role to play. And I see a lot of respect in the ecosystem as well. So frankly, I mean, product managers should look at designers as their buddies, use them as an extension of their core skills, you know. So there's a lot, that can go right with that kind of approach. And I think designers, a few cents of, advice for designers: that technical feasibility, understanding, what your feature can actually do or how it can be built, what is the roadmap. If you have that sensibility, then it's fine to try to sort of level up with your product owner, right? But that is a stepping stone. Without that, it is not possible for a designer to say that I am as good as, right? So I feel like both sides have a lot of power and they should unite versus staring at each other too much. So to say, yeah.
For sure, yeah. Really well said. Having obviously discussed the interplay or relationship between product and design, do you think the design function, especially senior designers, like I'm not talking about junior folks, like design leaders in within a company, should be owning outcomes as well? Because when I talk to design managers, they think of like design as an org, which is essentially executing on outputs or expectation from the product team, right?
Hmm.
Having said that, I feel the lines between design and product are blurry, and a lot of times I've seen good designers transition into like great product thinkers as well, right? Because they've been close to end users, they've been doing a lot of user testing. In fact, in my recent stints, I've like looked at design team, or in fact, my designer as like a source of like creativity and ideas, and they have had a lot of inputs in the roadmap in my last stint at Swiggy as well. So I feel designers should also grow out of their org and maybe own outcomes. Do you think that helps the business in the long run, or it's only something that can function well when designers transition into a product role?
I think that ownership is very important. Everybody should feel like they are a part of something larger. The minute you break it down into an Asana task or a Jira ticket, right? It's more of a task. It is not ownership. The ownership comes from how you build a shared vision. So I think if the approach is about sharing visions, then definitely each and every member of the team will step up to have that ownership. When there's a critical outcome to be taken care of, right? Sometimes it helps to have a leader at the front. So people will have to follow the lead, so to say. So I think it totally depends on the situation and the culture, but definitely shared ownership is a very, very big, I think it's a very big virtue to have in an organization, because that really helps people see how they can grow, right? Like even if you feel like a designer might be able to, grow into a product role at some point, it will be visible for them to see that if I take a few steps of ownership, this is my roadmap, right? Versus saying, wow, you need to design the screen really well, make sure the button is nice, big, bold, and blue and clickable, right? That's not ownership.
Got it.
Um, so yeah, I think it's about how you create that vision for the group or for the product. Yeah.
Got it. Going into like the fundamentals of design, right? There's this sort of, I won't call it a jargon, but design thinking has like different interpretations in corporates versus startups, right? Can you just help define what design thinking is? And fundamentally, like going into, okay, when you say we as a company follow design thinking, what does that essentially mean? And
Yeah.
like, if you can sort of give an example as well, the best thing, like rather than not going into theory of, hey, this is what design thinking is, maybe you can just pick an example of, hey, we were building X and this was the insight, and just taking that example into end.
So essentially, design thinking is just an approach, and it can be applied to anything and everything. Like you can apply it in your house also. You might have a decision, very important decision to take about maybe an expense in the house, right? Or how it might affect your financial goal planning in the house. You might want to see creatively how can we solve for this, right? That's design thinking. Or say a company says, we want to improve the experience of people walking into a store and how it makes them feel. So the classical example here is, when Steve Jobs started the entire chain of Apple stores, right? That is a very, very big example of design thinking. So that is customer experience at the end of the day. And design thinking is basically just problem solving, keeping sure that people who are involved in this are heard, understood, and engaged in the entire process. When you put it in the context of a company, along with that engagement of people comes maybe a compliance, maybe a policy, or maybe an onboarding process, right? And essentially you still want them to feel accepted, engaged. But how do you do this onboarding process along with the entire KYC, etc., that you might have to follow, right? All of that is design thinking. So I think design thinking is applicable to any scenario of life. Number one, when design companies say they do design thinking, what do we really do, right? So essentially, design thinking starts off with understanding, first of all, what is your core target audience? What are they really going to do? And what is the process that you want them to interact with, right? So once you have this very well laid out, and that's what the research does, you sort of lay out these two sides, like what is the business wanting people to do and what do people want to do. And then you're creatively thinking of answers over here. A design company will basically build in tools for ideation. They will build in the tools for ensuring that you're sort of checking off, say, technical feasibility or future roadmap vision, or aligning purpose with the company's overall agenda, etc., right? So it's a very, when design companies step in, it's a very structured process of implementing problem solving. That's all, in a very, very simple way. And to give you some examples, right? Like, I think when we say design thinking, we would say, okay, how can we make this onboarding process simple? That is one way of doing it. That's a very common understood way, right? We say this a lot, like, how let's make our onboarding very simple. The other way of, or the other thing that businesses benefit from when it comes to design thinking is actually adding the customer lens to technology, right? So big businesses, right, enterprises, they would either build their tech stack or they would have a third party integration with a tech stack. Right now what they want to do is to ensure that their target audience meets this tech stack in a very, very experiential way. I'm putting it very simply right now, but basically you got to marry the two sides, right? So let's take two brands, right? Like you might take, say, Make My Trip and say Expedia or whatever, right? Now, these two companies, they do exactly the same thing with, say, some minor differences here and there. But how do you recognize one from the other? It is the customer experience. Right now, that's what design thinking does. It basically says that you as a brand stand for this. This is what your customer wants. How are you going to engage with them?
Understand.
You can apply this problem solving method to any part of the customer experience, any part of the user journey, and come out on tops. Like, there is absolutely no downside of doing this. Even at a sprint level, I would think even at a sprint level you can do this. You're not, maybe not solving for too much, but maybe you will erase two buttons out of the journey, or maybe you will say minus out one step in the entire process. So that's what design thinking does.
Got it. So just to summarize, once you have that problem first approach, that is, hey, this is the problem you're solving. That's one. And the second thing you highlighted was thinking of the end customer and maybe empathizing with, hey, this is the person we are solving for. And whenever you are like trying to make a decision, ki, hey, X versus Y, you think of, hey, this is the consumer we're solving for. And basic customer lens and problem solving first would be the two tenets of design thinking, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what would a design company do, right? They would bring all this research to the table. So imagine that we're again trying to solve an onboarding process. An onboarding process will involve compliance people, risk people, the tech people, the product people, the design people, marketing people. You sort of put all of them together and you expose this research to them. You expose the entire customer lens to them, right? And they are the guys who actually make the process happen. So
Mm.
once they start empathizing with the customer, then they're able to sort of detangle the process and make it easier for them.
Got it. So Ishani, Steve Jobs used to say that, your decisions should be data informed with intuition. And he correlated intuition as the ability to have better product taste. So how should product managers or entrepreneurs or, even designers build a better product taste?
My interpretation of what Steve Jobs said is that basically you need to have passion. Product taste is nothing but passion, right? So
Correct.
I feel that, and I say this from my observation, right? I feel that it's important for anybody who has design sensibilities or is creative in solving problems should be highly observant in nature. You should be able to intuitively try out new things, be an early adopter, feel very comfortable with not knowing, losing your way, and that is what helps you develop the right taste. So I think developing good taste is learning by failing. It's like going to 5 restaurants and knowing which Italian restaurant is
Correct.
your most favorite, right? So it is intuition as well. Definitely intuition. That's what customer experiences work on, right? Like it's passion, intuition, and how you feel about it. So I would just recommend a lot of observation. That's what I do in my daily life. I do spend a lot of, you need to spend a lot of time being silent, being observant, taking mental notes. Very, very important to have your own structure of assessing, products and how people interact with them.
Shani, I've like done a lot of user interviews and sometimes I've felt how do you even take primary insight saying, hey, this was a big thing that the user was not able to figure. And maybe sometimes I've been in discussion when my designer was saying, hey, this person is an outlier. We should not consider this user interview. And I'll also add one more anecdote. There's this book that I recently read, Competing Against Luck, wherein the person said that you should not just take what a user tells you in a user interview or in a survey, take it with a pinch of salt. You have to take 2 steps back and figure out their struggling moment. I think there's a line in the book when they said that sometimes when the user says that they don't like this, it's not about them not liking this. You have to go back to their context of they don't like it because they had some previous experience of something similar. So it's not as straight as me seeing a end user struggle with a product. How do I even take notes from, because whatever I understand from observing an user, the implications of that could be very different from someone else observing the same user.
Yeah,
Because I come with a different context, I have a very different set of biases as well.
yeah.
And there'll be certain common themes for sure. Ki, hey, one or two things both of us will agree on. This thing is for sure a problem. It could be a usability problem. Ki, yahan pe user is getting stuck. But there could be certain underlying themes that maybe only I noticed, or maybe someone else noticed and I did not notice. So how do you get better at observing users? Is there a skill? And my guess is you guys are the best at that, right?
So honestly speaking, it's not like only designers are great at observational studies, right? I feel like it's a natural skill that anybody could develop over time. But you've asked a really, really important question. I feel like all designers or people who are involved with user testing should understand is that what you see is not what you need to believe. It is not necessarily an insight. And I think the most commonly misunderstood term in the design business is the word insight, right? So I think insight building is a very, 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 very deep subject. It is fed through lots of different sources, right? So you have to understand that when you do user testing, it is only one part of the evaluative research, right?
Mhm.
So first of all, are you a company that is doing a sample set of 300 people? Within those 300 people, are you sampling your customer base as per age, as your demographic, or even the psychographic, etc. All of these things matter when you are taking into just when you're doing user testing, right? Because you're right, when people react, there might be some underlying bias that is sort of reflecting in the way they speak. And I think the the intelligence that you would build before you do user testing is actually more vital than the user testing itself. Because when you speak to people, you must be able to analyze, first of all, how they might react. Okay. You need to have some assumptions in place. And then, of course, those assumptions are not just based on I feel, but it is based on the intelligence that would have been built out. So, assumptions are, I think, very important. You need to have some inkling of where this is headed. And the insight comes in areas where you did not expect a certain answer, right? And
Okay.
that's where you start analyzing, is this bias? If it is bias, then what kind of bias it is, right? There are tons of articles out there that help us understand the kinds of biases that people, the cognitive biases that people build over time, and that's how they react to services. And the other is also possibly sometimes you've not recruited well. We don't understand that recruiting is a very, very essential part of user testing. It's not just about friends and family. You have to be able to get the right kind of people with the right kind of mindset. So there are lots of different nuances in user testing. And you're absolutely right. It's not like, he said, I don't like this and therefore it is not to be liked. You have to take us 2 3 steps back, look at your intelligence, look at your assumptions, figure out what biases are coming into play, and then come up with your insight.
Got it.
Right. So I think it's only one part of evaluative testing. It's not the entire thing.
Got it. Got it. So to summarize here, there's some pre-work to be done before the actual research happens. You go to a user research or rather a user interview session with your list of assumptions. And you also have a profile of the user saying that, hey, this user is from, I'm not saying profile in terms of demographic attributes, also behavioral attributes. You have those attributes tied to your assumptions, and then you are trying to like tick your boxes, and maybe a new insight could pop up within your assumption construct, or it could be something out of the blue, and you're just making notes out of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the pre-work is very, very essential. I mean, a very, very structured user testing sheets will have a lot more detail, right? They will look at what is the goal you're trying to achieve, what is the stumble description, why did the user pause. You've got to really get into the skin of it. So yeah, I think you're very aptly summarizing this, right? The pre-work is super essential. You can't just go into user testing and say I spoke to 5 people and that's the end of the story.
Got it. Got it. And do you use any tools like from a product manager's lens? I think the biggest challenge I sometimes have, if I'm in a company which is mature, I'll have a lot of users, so I'll find it easy to recruit users. But if I'm like building something from scratch, I'll obviously seek out user research agencies. Therein, the obviously effort is very operationally driven by the sectional entity. So, and I know there are tools like user testing, but they essentially hire users who are not like Indian and regional. For example, if I'm building a product for basically Bharat or India tier 2, tier 3, how do I like leverage existing tech ecosystem? I'm not sure if you guys have been using anything at Spinach.
So it depends on what kind of digital capability or other digital the interaction that the customer needs to do with the product, right? Frankly speaking, in-person testing works like a charm. There is nothing that can replace in-person testing. Of course, there are lots of unmoderated tests that are available. You can even do moderated testing, but it like I said, it cannot replace in-person testing. And why is in-person testing, especially if you are not an established startup, right? You must be able to meet your customers. I feel that the aha moments come when you are actually seeing your customers interact with your product. Even if you take a sketch or a paper prototype, there is nothing that can replace that interaction, right? And what will you discover? I'm just thinking aloud, right? Like there are a couple of things that we don't realize when we go into user testing. One is that it, tier 2 is also very mature with their digital usage, right? It's just that they use it differently, right? They might not use WhatsApp the way we use it. right? Or maybe you and I might use it differently and we still don't know that, right? Or Instagram for that matter. Like tier 2 is extremely conversant with tools like Instagram. So their digital capability is not less than metros. I think the maturity of saying what that interaction is, I think tier 1 is very good with that. Like you can articulate your interaction really well. But tier 2 is great at application. Like they're great at taking their tools and using them for their benefit. So yeah, I think that it's not like you need something different to do with tier 2, tier 3. In-person testing is the best. It's irreplaceable according to me. And yeah, it's important to understand usage patterns more than anything else.
Mm.
Which you will not get in unmoderated testing. You're just going to get like a very functional and very objective output from these kind of testings. Yeah.
Got it. We've been speaking about design and research for the past few minutes. Just changing gears. One last question, Nishani. Coming back to Spinach Experience Design, your company, how are you acquiring clients? Obviously, word of mouth is one something you must have relied on back in the day. But like increasing revenue in a services business, it's super interesting, especially for product managers in B2B or SaaS, to learn how services businesses scale, increasing their revenue, right? So, like, how do you go about talking about yourself, or there are certain ways you have seen your businesses scaled over the last 5 years?
Yeah. So that question, I think, is sort of becomes very important when you don't come from the business background, right? And both of you already know, right? So we are pivoting right now, where we have a Spinach Studios earlier. We've now become Spinach Experience Design, and we're very soon launching our entire new branding and everything that comes with the revamp, right? So previously, I would say part of Spinach Studios, right? We were 100% referral based. Like we've never really had to. We've of course pitched. I think that it's not to say that we've never pitched. We've pitched, but we were very very sort of lucky to have good customers passing our name around, and we picked up a lot of good international businesses as well in that word of mouth. And because I used to be a consultant with McKinsey earlier, that helps as well. So the credentials really helped. Of course, my past life, which was in advertising, as well as the startup life that I had, it all sort of adds up. You don't realize it. You're not like sitting with the book and say, okay, this lead came from X, and therefore this is done really well. It's all very organic. It used to be very organic, but now with the pivot, of course, definitely there is going to be a much more structured approach to acquiring clients. And when I say acquiring clients, it's not the math, it's about the capability. I definitely think that part of Spinach's vision is never going to change. We will always be a capability driven design outfit. What that means is that our mindset will always be consulting first. And of course, if it ties back into people or whatever that is, outcomes, etc., that doesn't matter. As long as we are approached with the right attitude, or clients look at us with the right sort of perception, I think we've hit a home run there in terms of longevity. So that's one. The second is, like when we talk about services, right, it's important to stay relevant. What you really offer as a service or as a consulting, or even just as a interaction, I think it needs to be very very relevant. So number one, you must listen to what your client is asking for. You're not selling, they are buying, right? So you need to understand what is it that they really want, what are they trying to solve. It's not about, okay, doing design, or doing development, or making great design systems. It's about how that piece of work is actually going to elevate customer experience for the client. How is it building value for them? And I think one more step forward is, like, if designers can start thinking about metrics, right? What is it really solving for the business? That is where you sort of you need to empathize with the client, right? So service building is very very important. For example, back in the day, people only spoke about, when I say back in the day, like essentially when I started my journey, right, 10 years ago, it was all about, okay, let's build 5 screens of wireframes, make it a clickable prototype, and make some visual design, and we are home. Okay, let's put it into InVision, and we are done. It's not that anymore. All good customers, they want to explore their customer journey map, right? So that is service building. Like, how can you make sure that you're actually listening to the fact that the customer wants an experience map, or they will need an experience map? That is the intuition that you need to have with growing a business. Like, how are times changing, what are businesses moving towards? So 7 8 years back, it was a lot about doing, I would say, quick outcomes. Now it is more about agile, making sure you're tied in with the product cycle. So you have to evolve. Like, you cannot keep doing the same thing every day. I feel like you might do the same thing every day, but at least you have to keep upping the learning curve. So at Spinach, we try to do that internally as well as externally. We do a lot of learning and development at our end. We're tuned into a lot of international sort of, playbooks, where we understand how design is evolving as well as how business is evolving. And the same thing with clients, right? Like, we really spend some time to understand what is it that they're after, and the recommendation of the service happens much after. So that is our endeavor, and with the pivot, I'm hoping that we continue on this journey, not as a, I would say, as a revenue sort of thing, but more as a capability build, right? Like, so our intention is not to have a large team, but to have a really capable team, I would say.
For sure, like all the best, and I hope like next 3 years you grow like 40-50% annually. Uh, I did know we are done with a series of questions, but just one thing, since you were talking about customer feedback, it's a fun sort of question. I've been at the other side wherein I've sort of like come up with a certain design and like gone to certain leaders and they have said, given certain ambiguous feedback, कि feel नहीं आ रही है, मजा नहीं आ रहा. How do you sort? I'm pretty sure you've been at the receiving end of a lot of clients wherein they have given you a feedback which you have to interpret, and maybe you have prodded them like again and again, but you have not got something concrete. They have given you like very like 50,000 feet statements like he jazz it up or like try to like make it really beautiful, but what is beautiful in their lens, right? So
Yeah,
is
that
there
was
any
no, I
recent
get what you're saying. Yeah, that's a good question as well. And that happens, right? Because I think it's not necessary that only a very senior person will do that, right? Sometimes articulation can be hard, and you can't put your finger on it, right? Which is why, like I was saying, metrics are very important. Like, what is it that you're trying to do with this piece of design? When someone says feel nahi aa rahi hai, right? It's generally the visual design. So with a lot of years of experience, I can say that if someone says that, it's basically the design that's not doing a great job. Okay,
Mm,
and frankly, I'm of the opinion that when something doesn't work, people will not say ये button अच्छा नहीं लग रहा है. People say ये color अच्छा नहीं लग रहा है.
mm,
You know, so the UX is not questioned as much as the UI.
UI.
At least in the final scheme of things. I'm a UX person, right? And I know a lot of UX people will not agree with me, but frankly, when something doesn't work, right, the usability is understood. Like, अगर flow ही नहीं चल रहा है, तो वो समझ जाता है कि ठीक है, ये ब्रेक हो रहा है, समथिंग समथिंग. वो यूएक्स बहुत अपेरेंट होता है. बट जब कोई बोलता है ना फील नहीं आ रही है, इट इज द यूआई, वो मजा नहीं आ रहा है वो देखने में. So I think some of these feedbacks, right, you have to take it with a pinch of salt. And it is not like, of course, you will know somebody who is just saying it for the heck of it. उतना तो समझ ही जाता है. But it's important to keep exploring this, right? Like, okay, what are the metrics in visual design? Is it perception? Is it, is it discoverability? Is it, is it the tone of voice? Is it the brand appeal? These questions are very important, which is why I'm saying that everything that we build in design should have a certain metric ascribed to it, so that when you get a little ambiguous, you can actually start looking into your metrics sheet and say, okay, what this might be like. Build a few options and uh, keep keep trying, I would say.
provider. So with this, we end it. Thank you so much for doing this. I think we covered a range of topics from like your services, company, how it's grown to like design, thinking, and everything. So thank you, Eshani. That's it.
Thank you guys so much for having me. I don't think I've spoken so much about my journey ever, except my husband. I don't think anybody's ever heard about my journey. So yeah, thank you for having me, and definitely looking forward to staying connected with PM School.
Awesome. Thank you so much.